Welcome to the Rooted Healing podcast, where we seek to deepen our kinship with the living landscapes around us and within us. This is a space where stories heal with words that weave us closer to our wild and interrelational nature, where we explore ways to root down intimately with the land, ecosystems, communities, and practices that help us heal, reimagine, and co-create the world we remember to belong in.
For me, just engaging with ceremonial consciousness, engaging with ritual as a way of just stilling the noise. It can bring multiple people into a space of shared intent, of shared being, of shared humanity. And there's just a preciousness in that silence. There's a preciousness in that mode of consciousness which is different from the norm. Every single action is important in the currency of consciousness. Every single action is feeding the currency of consciousness. And when we come together in these particular moments of ceremonial consciousness, that is having an amplifying effect. And it is a way of upholding and giving praise and gratitude for the laws that hold all this fabric of the cosmos together.
Dr. Matthew Zylstra is a systems ecologist passionate about deepening the human-nature relationship for the healing of people and planet. He has 20 years of international experience in social-ecological research and outdoor education, with an MSc in environmental science and a PhD in conservation ecology and sustainability education. His doctorate research explored how meaningful nature experiences and nature connectedness motivate pro-environmental behaviour and regenerative leadership, which, 10 years on, remains a very relevant resource today, with insights from his research and his publications informing several global initiatives and university curricula. Matthew is Programme Director with the Kwendalo Institute and Research Fellow with the Centre for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University. He lives in South Africa with his family and finds happiness and healing in exploring intertidal life above and below the surface along his local coastline. Accompanying this episode, Matthew has gifted 2 PDF books for our Patreon community. One is Cave and Contemplator, which he wrote in 2015, and also the book Cultural and Spiritual Significance of Nature in Protected Areas, which is about governance, management and policy, edited by Bas Verschuren and Steve Brown. And these are brilliant resources if you're interested in this conversation and more specifically in social ecology. And we will announce the winners for our most recent giveaways this week on Patreon, which included Isla MacLeod's beautiful book, Rituals for Life, and Osprey Oriel Lake's book, The Stories in Our Bones, which is a really gorgeous read. So if you'd like to join this humble community who are supporting this show and who receive lots of additional resources from our guests, head to patreon.com/rootedhealing. For more on Matthew's post-research and writings, visit eyesforearth.org, and for current endeavours, see earthcollective.net. All the links are in the show notes. I really loved this conversation and found it stirred up a lot for me to chew on and reflect on. I met Matt when he attended one of our earth medicine retreats. Yet I had known of his work previously through my friend Dr. Sam Gandhi, who's also been on the show. And Sam is a huge fan of Matt's work, to say the least. So you'll sense these ongoing connections in the way the conversation flows. There's a song that I often sing in ceremony that I was gifted by a dear Ecuadorian sister of mine, and it comes from Taita Vladimir, and it's Ajida Ajide. And Matt really loved this song in ceremony and later played it to his son at home, who has learnt the song, and it's just the sweetest thing I've ever heard. So we've included a little snippet at the end, and I hope it melts your heart as much as it does mine, as it ties into the closing of our conversation really beautifully. And we are returning this summer with our gathering Ancestral, where we embody the ancient ways of our Indigenous ancestors, the ones who lived in full relationship with the landscapes, and through the animate landscapes, roundhouse councils, ceremonies, and intimate village life, we access their wisdom and guidance for these turbulent times with new and ancient eyes. It's worth noting that in this interview, Matthew speaks out of his personal capacity, and his views are not necessarily shared by his affiliations. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Matthew.
The landscapes that have really shaped me and continue to speak to me are probably threefold, given, I guess, the global nature of me and where I've been brought up and where I've now landed. I was born in, the nation they call Australia, on the land that's now known as Gubbi Gubbi country, or Cowan Cowan country, north of Brisbane. And the landscapes there that were particularly powerful were the tidal pools and the tidal flats on the peninsula. It was sort of the suburbs. It wasn't, it was urban, but it had nearby coast. And I remember looking across the bay to these mountains, which Captain Cook called the Glasshouse Mountains. But they have a beautiful Aboriginal story behind them. They're these monoliths, and the Aboriginal story comprises a family of 3 or 4. And there's Tibragargan, Biwa, and Kunarun. And there's a story there. And I think that story for me was sort of the first idea of mythos in the landscape. And looking across those mountains, and when we drove past around the bay quite close, was always very powerful for me. And then, I left Australia basically in 1999. I've been back for various reasons, but I haven't resided there properly. And I spent a large time in Europe, and then the woods in the Netherlands in 2005 was a place for a very powerful experience for me, which really was a pivotal point in reorienting my relationship with the natural world and where I was headed. And that's a story that I've retold in my PhD dissertation and elsewhere. And then since 2007, I've resided here in South Africa on the Southern Cape, and this landscape was and continues to really have been instrumental in shaping my understanding of nature connection, and was also the catalyst for my research into meaningful nature experiences as well.
I want to hear more about the experience in the forest in the Netherlands.
It followed the death of a close friend who died in a hiking accident in Iceland, and the unexpectedness of that news, it just came out of nowhere and it just throws you into this blur of what. And so I took my bicycle and went into the woods and, sat down and just tried to compose myself. And I guess I was very much engaged with rigorous scientific endeavor then. Even though I'd had some spiritual awakenings earlier in my life, they'd kind of been very distant at that point in time. And I sort of, I guess I just muttered or murmured a prayer of sorts to his spirit as if it were there. And following that little prayer, 3 dragonflies, one by one, landed on me. And one landed on my right shoulder, one landed on my left forearm, and the other landed just above my forehead. And actually, in the moment, it almost felt normal. It just was almost like a fluidity of like, oh yeah. But there was a massive catharsis during that experience of just really, and it continued to have this, this mycelial effect, like yeast in dough, just really, from that moment onwards, I kept coming back to it, like what is really going on there, and what happened. And I'm an ecologist, so I looked for those explanations. I wasn't near water. I was trying to work out, could there be something else? But it was very hard to, and even when I shared with friends, it was hard to just discount it in a sort of some sort of purely ecological way. Interestingly, the only time I've had that experience since was when I've reflected on that moment. And it has been two particular encounters years later where I've dwelt on that moment while walking, and actually while doing it on a more ritual kind of fast, where I've gone on a solo walk and a fast, and I've thought about the dragon. Like I might have seen a dragonfly and gone, oh, there you go. I wonder if. And in those two occasions, a dragonfly landed on the brim of my hat and stayed with me for a long time. And it's not something that's happened to me since. So the preciousness in that moment and in those moments is still with me. And it's certainly shaped a lot of how I've looked at my relationship with nature.
I think there's something really beautiful and liminal about the winged ones and their capacity to be carriers or messengers. Or I even wrote a short story once about a barn owl, and from the barn owl's perspective, and I tried to really channel this wise old barn owl, and I called the winged ones the tellers, as though we, as birds speaking from the barn owl perspective, we get these whispers in the wind, and we just know that we need to pass the message on, and we're the tellers. And that's something you've written about a little bit. Specifically, I know that you've got a story related to your son's birth. So I'd love to just go into that.
Diving right in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, there is something about winged creatures, and it's something which has been reported across various traditions. Just to preface this, and the Latin word, or the Latin root for omen is auspex, which is the interpreter of signs of birds given by birds. And I think the Greek also is oinos, oionissa, which is also relates to bird of prey or the bird of omen. And it was actually in a book that a former student gave to me. It was by a guy called Manly Hall from the 1920s. And I think it's called something like the secret traditions of all ages. And he goes through all these belief systems. But there's something about the winged creatures that he also identified as being, or any animal that interfaces between elements, but that's more readily affected by the impulses of the gods. And that also applies to insects. But you can, and I have spent time with various cultural traditions around the world, and I've been fortunate for that. And the birds as messengers does come up time and again. And, particularly around death, or particularly, if not death, times of deep, I guess, psychological searching, need, activity. And I mean, sort of synchronicity in general is often associated with need and times of transition. But yeah, the birds, for me personally, and from stories I've heard, seems to come up time and again. And the story around my son's birth was, we'd had planned a home birth. We ended up with a C-section, and the first few days following that were quite stressful. And we were in the center of a city, the biggest city here, and we had to take a decision on some treatment for him. And I was just really, it was starting to get a little bit overwhelming. And I walked outside, and as I went up the stairwell, a olive woodpecker was on the side of the window rapping. And I was just, I know enough about the ecology of an area that an olive woodpecker is not something you'd see in the center of the city against a building. It was a long way from its natural habitat. It's usually pretty secretive. It's not a rare bird, but you don't see them every day. I mean, woodpeckers just tend to be like that. So it really astonished me. And I mean, I know that, birds can rap and tap their reflection in windows. So there's that part of me, but that was sort of irrelevant. What was important for me in that moment was it just had this sense of, and I think it's important for all this experience that, that we're not alone, that we're part of something bigger. And there was something there that just gave me a sense of hope and faith, and it created a different sort of resolve in my mindset at that time to actually say, no, we've got this, trust in the process, things will work out. And yeah, our son gained weight in the next 24 hours, and gained weight naturally without us needing to, to do the interventions we needed. And so Yeah, it was very close to me to have that experience, and it just really felt like. Oh, well, I think the other thing was nobody else in the stairwell saw it. There was other traffic around there going up and down, but nobody else saw it. And there was that sense of, oh, it's there for me. And I'm always surprised about how people didn't see it because there was enough people around, but it was just me being able to stop and have that moment. So it was very precious.
It's funny because this isn't a winged story, but when I read your piece about that, I felt such a vivid recall of being in hospital thinking my cancer had come back and I was by myself. It had been the most stressful trip because I had a contract overseas and the appointment had come through really last minute after a scan I just felt totally overwhelmed. I had no mobile reception and I was waiting for my blood test and there was a fish tank in front of me and I was crying. And I absolutely swear that this actually happened, but one of the fish started communicating with me and it was telling
Wow.
me, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. And it was doing this little dance and it was looking at me and it was making me laugh. It was like, look, uh, just don't worry. You've got this. I promise you, you've got this. And I can't even explain. And I've been back to that same waiting room in that hospital for the past 10 years. And the fish are just very normal fish, just going about fish business in that tank. But for 10 minutes, I felt like this fish was looking me right in the eye, moving and dancing and talking to me.
Wow. And how did that feel for you? What was the, you know,
Just I'm not alone. And there's an animacy. I didn't have that language back then, but there's an aliveness in this world that is holding me and magic. There's some magic still that I don't know about, that I don't understand.
yeah, I mean, it's always an invitation into mystery, isn't it? It's like this little veil from the normal pattern of reality that we've been enculturated with. The veil lifts just momentarily, and it's this invitation into mystery and an invitation into animism, like you say. This sense of the world that was, for 98% of our human history, that was what we took for granted. There was no need to name it. That was it. That all things, were alive, and those moments do remind us of that possibility, and that animism may not be dead. That what it really requires is just us to turn and attend to it.
The way you've researched these meaningful experiences in nature and also synchronicity, and from the seat of being an ecologist, I just find that really intriguing. And something I've heard you speak about is this idea of directing our attention, or where attention goes, energy flows. And what has this entailed for you? What were the big shifts in reorientating your attention?
Attention for me is really sort of the golden key for unlocking so much of a more um, vibrant and vital relationship, with the rest of nature. And I've been thinking recently about it in terms of the alchemy of attention, that there's something about the way we attend that can really change everything. And, there's been some wonderful speakers and scholars who are also embracing this concept, and particularly the likes of Ian McGilchrist. I'm very fond of his thinking, and we might come back to some of that later because there's some different interpretations of that
Mm.
on this work as well. One of the big shifts for me actually came not so much in my ecological work, but I was quite focused on geopolitics in the early 2000s, and frustrated about certain things, and I wanted to share with everything. And that was my ruminations were all very much in the geopolitical landscape, and were unhealthily so. I think they still could have been on the money, but it was such a form of rumination. And I remembered it wasn't clear to me at the time, but so much of what I was encountering was a direct reflection of those ruminations, and not just in day-to-day interactions, but even sort of global events almost seemed to
Mm.
be in my lived reality, seemed to be reflecting where I was in my head. And fortunately, I had to do my master's thesis in northeast Arnhem Land, actually northwest Arnhem Land back it was, which is in the northern part of Australia. And I was basically had no internet for the best past of 6 months, a very limited internet. And it was this, if my rumination was an addiction, it was totally the going cold turkey in that sense. And it was incredible then how when my attention shifted, not only did my day-to-day lived interactions shift, but also it all of a sudden seemed that the global political landscape was shifting, the very thing that I was ruminating about. And there's a sense of magical thinking to that, which we might come back to later. But for me as a lesson, it was like, oh, hang on, my attention is really having a big impact on everything that I'm encountering, whether I can explain it or not. So when it comes back to our sense of connection with nature, what I really have found is that, and what's helped me is just really being aware of where is my attention right now? What am I editing out and what am I taking in? This whole, this reality we have is just so intricate, it's just so complex, it's so vast that we can't take in anything. And the intentionality in consciousness is designed to focus on those things which are immediately relevant to our survival, which might help us form bonds with the people we're with, so we have to edit out. And over the course of human history, what we were taking in and what we're editing out is very different to now. And now we're bombarded by this super stimuli, all sorts of things which are driving our attention, capturing it, if you will, away from the animate earth. And so I find myself, when I am much more aware of where I'm placing my attention, it has these rippling effects in my day-to-day life, in my being, in my nervous system, which affect the experiences I have and my understanding and relationship with place.
There's a great art, isn't there, of finding that dance of being responsive and tending to the collective shifts, and then also being fully in this sort of original nervous system regulated state of place and community and that in-person connection. I find it something that I very much need to continue to metabolize and mature into, because modern life is also so fast and furious that it's almost designed, this productivity myth of progress. It's designed so that it's so hard to pull away. I mean, you kind of had no choice for your research to have that cold turkey, as you called it, remedy. So what's that dance like for you? I'm curious.
Yeah, I hugely relate. I think not attending to global matters and zooming out can sometimes feel like a cop-out. Where do I show up? How do I show up? So I guess I just have to keep coming back to how do I show up as my best self today, and what is that going to imply for my attention as well. Interestingly, our son definitely has tended to pick up things, particularly prior to having his ego land as a 3-year-old, but in that phase of when they're just more, resembling as if they're pure spirit, in those first couple of years, his crying could sometimes, I felt there was a strong correlation to me going down a particular narrative hole on a particular topic, and him waking up in the middle of the night all of a sudden, and so that for me, I think being attentive to those things, and that's, again, of being open to the idea that of everything being interconnected, of mind matter relationships as being one narrative, and one plausible narrative in some situations. We are in this attention economy where, we are intentionally distracted, and I think we're being, our capacity to attend for any length of time has been shattered through social media, through the rampant news cycles. Our capacity for prolonged empathy is being really hammered. And so you have this horrible sense of desensitization, which results of that, where you do turn off, you do turn away. And it's one thing turning away from, from something global, thousands of miles away, but that filters down, and then soon you're turning away from the person who needs help on the side of the road, and I mean, this is a real this is a real concern, this desensitization. And this probably, feeds into some of what Ian McGilchrist has talked about, with this left brain, right brain kind of thinking. And one of the things that I think particularly bothers me in our sort of narrative, I mean, we all want to focus our attention and be focused. And that's sort of some of the things we're told. Like if you look at these self-help courses, what do they want most? They want us, what do most people want is to be able to focus again. So people are feeling the sense of distraction. People want to focus. They probably feel good when they're in that focus, but it can be a very narrow focus. And evolutionary, we had to evolve with two types of attention. We had the narrow focus and attention, which was, if you take the metaphor of a bird, looking for the seeds and having the one eye on the seeds to find where's the next piece of grain, where's the next seed. And you had the other eye, which was attending to the interrelationship of things, which was looking for birds of prey, and we are, I think, as a Western society, very stuck into this narrow form of focus. And the problem with that is that we do start to ignore the bigger interconnections of what's actually happening. And that is, I think, where we get into this immense ecological blindness of our situation. Because it's not happening in my narrow reality, then it's not happening. So there's a lot of paradoxes here, what I just said, but I mean, that is life, I think, is to somehow hold the paradox and to navigate this paradox, and if I'm focused on that, what am I editing out? It's not just understanding what we're looking at, it's being aware of what could I be filtering out of my experience.
Yeah, and coming into a deep intimacy with what our strengths and what the ecosystem of who we are is, how we're growing towards the sun. It's in so many different directions, isn't it? Some of us are vines, some of us are sunflowers. I love that you're bringing that right brain, left brain perspective into it, because it's huge and also gives language, I think, to what a lot of psycho-spiritual development has been. It's been put in this box of ascension models or bidirectional models. So we ascend up to enlightenment and we descend down to more primitive earth body realms. And that in itself, I can link to this left brain detaching from the bigger picture, leaving interconnectivity in the matter, the mother of all life. And whereas the right brain asks us maybe for psycho-spiritual development that looks much more like relational expansion and contraction and very much in this embodied existence. And I think science in a way also had this element of, so much about science takes us into the universe, because that is a very exciting place to want to know about, but it's still this away from this relational, intimate existence here, which I think is why I found such resonance with animism, mostly though from this very experiential sense of it. So I'd love to come to what ceremonial consciousness might be to you.
The idea of ceremonial consciousness really segues of what we just spoke about with attention. And I think it's this idea, cultivated, throughout millennia, through the thousands of generations of humanity that came before us, is that there are certain moments which require us to come together in a particular kind of way and, actually focus attention in a particular kind of way. That we have to be very clear of our own lens when we're talking about this. We are from we have this very distinct, unusual way of looking at the world. And Joseph Heinrich, the neuroscientist, put out a wonderful article back in 2010 or something. Him and his colleagues just showed that we are weird, and weird was Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and he put D as democratic. I debate that these days. I maybe say distracted or desensitized, but we have a very unique way of looking at the world. And so I think it's important to understand that we are not the norm. So everything I comment on here now, I think it should be understood in that perspective. And again, I'm from a particular cultural background with a particular life history. And I think it needs to be very clear. And so for me, what I've really found powerful is that whether or not I really have a sense of believing that that action might lead to that result, it is in the act of doing it itself that is a kind of reverence, a kind of praise and appreciation for the mystery of life that I'm doing it. And over the course of history, you could almost call it like a sort of sympathetic magic, in that, we do these things in the hope or the belief that such and such may occur. And, cultures around the world have done that, and potentially have done it with such rigorousness and such a unison that the gods, or the ancestors, or, the animus in nature has responded. And here in Southern Africa and throughout Africa, these sorts of ceremonies, this ceremonial consciousness is inculcated all the time in terms of relationships with ancestors, or going to the forest to commune with the forest spirits. And there's a sense that if a ritual or an activity is done, and there is not a response from nature, that the ancestors haven't taken it. The ancestors have the ritual is not done correctly, or what have you. And we can maybe judge, well, this is going into superstition or what have you. But for me, what's so important here is that, whether or not the experience is ultimately judged as real is irrelevant. The importance is that there's an interpretation, and that has a causal effect on our behavior and how we show up in the world. And so, for me, just engaging with ceremonial consciousness, engaging with ritual, has a way of just stilling the noise. It can bring multiple people into a space of shared intent, of shared being, of shared humanity. And there's just a preciousness in that silence. There's a preciousness in that mode of consciousness, which is different from the norm. The psychologist Steve Taylor, he's from England, has written a couple of excellent books, and one of them was called Awakening Experiences: How They Occur and How to Maintain Them, something like that. But he had this idea of the intensification and stilling of life force. And he looked at all the different ways you can have these awakening experiences, and he found that many of them come up from breaking your homeostasis, your usual sensory and habitual ruts in your physiology. And when they get disturbed in a particular kind of way, you can have an awakening experience. But the way to make them more permanent is this idea of intensifying and stilling life force. And that can come through meditation, but I believe it can also come through, these profound acts of prayer and ritual.
Yeah. I mean, that's for me where plant and fungi medicines have been such an aid, because this weird culture, so much has been stigmatized through hundreds of years of oppression of more pagan belief systems and folklore, into a real shaming of spirituality, to the point that now science also sits on that throne too. And I think it's really hard for people to allow receptivity into the ritual, into the healing grounds of the ritual, because ritual is also rooted in theatre. And, for me to realise, having had a background in theatre, how linked this sense of creating receptivity for mystical experiences, these two worlds are, a huge part of my inquiry with the work is how to most effectively call people in, allow them to become as receptive as possible, and then create in a way that feels most alive with land and lineage and ancestors. For me, at least, that feels really important. The ceremonial encounter that will offer reflection and insight and change. There's something you reflected during our time together that I found very poignant, and set a really strong example of making that internal decision to become more receptive, or to shift that inner narrative. I'm not feeling this, I'm not feeling connected, and okay, I'm going to change that story. And I thought it might be interesting to hear you speak to that, only if you're happy to.
No, sure. Yeah, I mean, as you were speaking, it was actually bringing up my thinking of that experience, but also just in general, this need for us to give ourselves permission, and not just that, but to actually say, what if my map of reality, what if my story of reality is not true? You know, can I actually step into that for a moment? Can I leave that at the door? And, you know, for me, during our time together, what I had to realize was that some of the stories that I might have been telling myself about myself may not have been true, you know. And at what point was I actually going to say, what if they're not true? What if there's something else going on here, which is completely different? And this is then linked to, well, how much do I want this to be able to fully show up without taking some part of me into this experience or into this moment, which may not be serving me? And, you know, this also links with this idea of ceremonial consciousness, that there's something there that is so important that has to be done. You know, and cultures, you know, would have thought that if this ritual, various indigenous cultures would have come with the mindset that if this ritual or this act is not done, then something in the order of the cosmos, you know, could actually fall apart. It was that important. And I don't think we have that sense anymore. Like, it's like, oh, well, if I do it, I do it. If I don't, I don't. But if we can actually just put that on for a moment, then entering these spaces becomes very different in terms of how we go. Like you actually say, this could be life or death. So I wasn't quite so melodramatic in my own sense during our experience, but I really thought, well, you know, I've come here and there's a lot that conspired for me to reach this point. There's a lot that I had to invest and give up to come here. There was big opportunity cost in coming to join Earth Medicine. So, you know, what parts of me right here have to be left behind? How can I be open to a different story? How can I be open to a different model of reality than the one that I may have come in with? And I mean, that's an invitation that I would, you know, offer to anyone, not just on your programs, but in day-to-day life, to be able to take the moment and say, what if my model of reality is not applicable here? I recently was introduced a couple of years ago to this idea of multi-model agnosticism. And I came through it through the book of John Higgs on, believe it or not, on the KLF, which was the 80s, 90s band. And I would have never thought I would have read a book about a band, but I know of John Higgs's work. He's written a lot on William Blake, and I had heard a podcast and I thought, yeah, I've got to dive into this. It's brilliant. And he, at the end of the book, beautifully, expertly done, you know, contrast magical thinking with multimodal agnosticism. And multimodal agnosticism is a term that I think came from Robert Anton Wilson, who was one of the proponents of Discordianism. There's a philosophical history there. It's worth looking into. But I think that one of the big problems that we have in the Western mind is always looking for universals and wanting to say that there's one model here that is the model. And this is causing the breakdown of communication between friends, between families, between people who would otherwise share the same values. But for some reason, we're so attached to this one model, this map, these lines that we've drawn on the map. I mean, it's just, and this can really derail so much of our understanding of the world. And so, you know, what we've entered into today is this, in many of these stories, you could call it a kind of magical thinking. That is one model. And it's one model that can be used to explain those experiences, that can be used to explain this, but it's not always the model. And I think that's another thing, you know, to come back to your question is just like, which model is appropriate here? And which model am I taking in? And is it always the model? And so, you know, the experiences we've spoken about could be explained through animism. You could be more specific and say, well, when these birds show up, it's the ancestors. It's the ancestors taking the shift, the form of the bird. You could look at it as divinity, God. I mean, we all have these models, and I've come to realize that I actually find so much joy in now not being attached to one model, to be able to release that. And I think it enriches my experiences and enhances my openness and receptivity to a range of experiences, that I don't have to immediately plug it in and say, it's that because of that.
Yeah.
And and I've often, when I've encountered synchronicity and these meaningful experiences, I find a lot of use in the Daiji, the yin yang symbol, which is, the more I sort of look at it, the more I get out of it. It's so simple, but yet so profound. And it's like that. If you take that symbol, it's like that in every experience, there's a yin, which could be the ecological, naturalist sort of explanation, but there's never entirely satisfying. There's always that little dot. And the other side could be your more magical thinking, the psychological, the noetic, something which is alluding to something more. But yet you can't get too attached on that, because it's going to be some ecological component of that. And yet together they make this fluid whole where one is always weaving into the other. And I, as an ecologist, whenever I encounter a meaningful experience with nature, that's the part of me I love to hold. Yes, there was the magic of the dragonfly, and I can hold that as well as saying the dragonfly was rapping on its reflection in the window. And there's a coexistence there, which I'm quite comfortable with. And many people might challenge, well, you're just fence sitting, or that's not, coming to one thing. But I don't think we have to hold one monolithic view of reality. I think reality is constantly changing. Our perception and awareness is changing. I know that I can have a particular perception when I'm in a city scrolling on a social media or on the WhatsApp group or something, and that is miles away of what I feel when I'm in the mountains. The kinds of thoughts that are coming through, the appreciation of things there can be far more profound. I can appreciate a spore left by an animal there far more than I can appreciate the most profound statement from Buddha that I've just found on scrolling through my WhatsApp feed, because my mind, or maybe I'm in left brain, right brain, but there's something completely different. So these models work in different places, and that's something very important that I think that I feel I need to emphasize.
That was brilliant. You've left me with many fireworks going off in many different directions. I've often thought, in a very similar sense, that the ecosystems themselves have imagination. Every single component of the ecosystem has an imagination that is almost, that can be projected into this soup that we inhabit. And that all these different realities exist, both in matter and in the imaginal, and that we share an aspect of that imaginal. It ripples into each other. And so, reincarnation stories happen all the time in areas in the East where it's believed in. These children come through with amazing memories from past lives, names, even another language sometimes. And yet it doesn't happen so often in weird culture or other parts of the world. And that could actually mean that our imagination may also influence how we do go into beyondness. And if we have a belief system that is involved around a deity or ancestors or becoming a guardian angel, that we almost craft that transition onward. And I don't know, but there's a sense of everything is also dreaming, and it's all a big soup, and it's all very diverse. And what might be real in one part, in a particular ecosystem, say the desert or a dry part of the world, could be so different in the imaginal realm and in another part. Appreciating that words are very clumsy trying to articulate or even attempt to articulate what I know I'm feeling about it.
Yeah, I just want to speak to that. I mean, there's something very profound there, and I think that's that's a really important thought. And again, it just speaks to this, the nuance, the need for nuance that we're losing, and this contextual thing. So there's a good friend of mine who's an anthropologist, and tends to be very, I wouldn't say skeptical, but he has a resistance about some of this kind of thinking. But he has come to this sense that within particular areas, he spends time to hunter-gatherer groups, and he's come across these stories, but he has a sense that, within that particular cultural ecosystem, there is such a field of belief that there can be a reality that's actually perceptible, but only to those in that field of belief.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like that in their social, cultural, ecological ecosystem, there's no separation. There is stuff that's enacted so habitually that it is shaping consciousness in a way where that is real. And yet to the outsider cannot see it because they haven't been conditioned and patterned in a way to see it. And it's like these fields of attentional and intentional patterns actually create little realities around the world. And some of those realities could be explained through, like you say, particular deity. It could be reincarnation, what have you. And that is a model that works and is probably real in that particular context, but not necessarily be real for us. And I think the danger for us is that we are being actively disenchanted and even lacking the propensity to reimagine. And so magical thinking is incredibly important for creativity, for art, for theatre, for drama. Like, it might not be useful to, some sort of technical problem, with IT, but it's incredibly important in terms of bringing us forward in our humanity and writing music and creating pieces of art. I mean, that's where it all rests. So again, both models can coexist.
And there was something you also reflected on that reminded me of this idea of original instruction. You said something about ritual being believed in some cultures to be fundamental to the running of the universe, or the running of the world, of the order of life. And that reminds me of the notion of original instruction, these myths and stories and narratives that are carried through from the early ancestors to live in right relationship with the world. And I think of the Wheel of the Year and how it's been perceived so naive to have these ceremonies and these rituals that our earlier ancestors here in Britain, I know at least, really believed were vital to the flourishing of a good harvest and planting the seeds, and how woven our bodies were into those rituals as well, and the archetypes that were woven in. And the loss of that has had tremendous effect on the law of nature and the order of the universe, because we lost that relationship with the honorary harvest, with, and causing climate change. And we've just had two magnificent storms here, and just feeling the rage of those winds has reminded me how, having grown up on a farm, I could so imagine how that would have been a message of, you've done something wrong, actually, something's wrong here, and I'm angry. I could feel it. I could feel this anger in the wind. And who knows how much I'm projecting there. And also, I love storms. I love the drama that they can fill us with, when we feel safe to receive that. But I guess what I'm trying to get to is this, of how fundamental animistic perspective, or simply coming together to commune and reflect in some kind of ritual, or in some kind of equal understanding of the other, that has been the key to the breakdown we're now experiencing.
It's a tantalizing question, and I find myself oscillating a bit on that, because I guess the more Zen or Buddhist side of me might just say it's all just fluff, it's all just dressing, not that they don't engage in rituals, but there's a part of it that you just go, well, just, stick with it. And then part of my earth medicine experience was that, looking at it from, there was an experience during one of the ceremonies where it did just all melt away as being dressing and fluff. But at the same side, completely holding that and completely okay is, no, actually, every single action is important in the currency of consciousness. Every single action is feeding the currency of consciousness. And when we come together in these particular moments, of ceremonial consciousness, that is having an amplifying effect. And it is a way of upholding and giving praise and gratitude for the laws that hold all this fabric of the cosmos together. And I really felt that for the first time when I spent time with different Aboriginal groups in Northern Australia. They call it law. And as in LA, I mean, that was their sort of translation, the law. And this law came through the dreaming, which is also a beautiful term. I love the term, the dreaming, the dream time. And, these things had to be upheld because they had to be upheld. There wasn't a case of what if you didn't do them. It was like, you have to, because, this came from the ancestors into antiquity, and we need to do this to, whether it's to sing the land, to honor the passing of people in a particular kind of way. And now those ceremonies are not being done. And, whether it was through missionary and Christianization in a particular kind of way, be very clear to emphasize that I don't believe all Christianity is like that. There are various interpretations of it, but certainly the missionizing through a colonial lens, was a big part of destroying that and saying it's rubbish. And then, of course, you had the scientific sort of paradigm, which said, well, no, there's no spirit in that mountain. Don't be silly. Either the spirit is up there in the sky, or there's none at all. And so then you had full license to clear cut that mountain because there's no spirit there anymore. And this is where the work that I've been involved, with a colleague on sacred natural sites and the spiritual values of nature, where it's so important because, there many traditional cultures were creating protected areas through their animist beliefs, and for the longest time, scientists and what have you might have gone and said, oh, it's rubbish. And now there's a sense of like, oh, hang on. It might have been rubbish, but let's see what was happening. Those areas of high biodiversity were being protected, and not just protected, but actually sung and danced. And, there's a correlation between high biodiversity and sacred natural sites, because they're also tending the wild. And so the belief system, whether we liked it or not, was actually an important part of this beautiful relationship with the land. And this has been hugely lost in conservation. And devastating, devastating in that a lot of scientific conservation is still done through the reductionist materialist lens, well intended, but jettisoning any idea of deeper emotional and spiritual relationships with land.
Yeah, that's a huge one. Just seeing such almost it comes back to that sort of science versus spirituality polarization that so easily happens, but recognizing in conservation and in a lot of climate justice movements that lack of meaning making in the process, and that lack of collaboration with the more spiritual ideas of what it means to inhabit place and be guardian of place. And so without that, you see burnout, you see crazy amounts of burnout, because the heart is there, the care is really there. But when weird culture doesn't have the receptivity, the cultivated receptivity through our internal narratives to actually feel held in the process by something beyond us, it's a very lonely journey, I think, and can replicate systems of harm and anthropocentric tendencies in the process. I often question myself with the work I'm doing with rooted healing. Am I putting too much focus on people? Too much focus on helping people connect with nature in a profound way. That's really what I want, is this profound reconnection, so that all the anxiety, depression, concerns can be forevermore aided by a magical or animistic or profound, whatever word, relationship with the natural world. And that would then create increased guardianship as well. And so I'm sort of trusting in those ripples, but I do sometimes have the question of, is it enough? And I think something you said earlier about the difference in meaning of being in the mountain and seeing the evidence of a wild animal along the same path versus perhaps a really deep philosophical statement shared over WhatsApp. And I have been feeling quite guided towards survival in nature and the really basic skills, and almost wondering whether that's maybe what people need as they, the ceremony for me, and the fluff, which your inner critic might have had a process with, is trying to bring once again into attention our elemental existence and that interconnectivity between all of us, that shared existence. And maybe it might be more effective because of all the stigma that exists in our narratives, just to put people in the wild and build fires and make food and experience life with the indigenous psyche, activating that remembering. I'm just, where do you sit on that line of how to invite people to connect the most effectively?
The way that we would have lived close to the land, for 97% of our human history, so much of those things would have just happened by the way. That was just part of the lifestyle. So much of what we're trying to inculcate now through workshops, through practices, through this and this, a sort of disparate bits, were just all part of being close to the land. The act of tracking an animal brings in so much, which now we end up practicing as mindfulness, or we end up practicing as embodied movement, or we end up practicing as animal communication or something like that. So I mean, that's the first answer. And so that embodied sense of rewilding, getting onto the land, learning those skills, for me is huge, and it's been a big help to my own cultivating a sense of place and sense of connection as well. I've still got a long journey to go, but there's wonder there, and there's never sort of definitive answers. There's never an end to the journey. There's always an ongoing unraveling and unwrapping. We have we're always, as humans, seem to have this attentional incest kind of problem. We are enamored with ourselves, we're enamored with our own things, and even the best of intentions, we can sometimes, get back into an anthropocentric thing very quickly, and that's not always an issue. And I certainly wouldn't level that at the work that you're doing, but because a big part of the healing and enhancing the relationality with the rest of human nature is just being able to better to relate to ourselves, and we're creating all these compartments, but ultimately there is no compartment. But I do think fundamentally we have to learn to attend, and learning to attend to the rest of nature. Nature being a very problematic word, but I'm always using the rest of nature. In a moment-to-moment basis, it's, as I was sort of alluding to earlier, it's always just coming back to, what am I noticing now? And where is my attention now? And I've come across a very useful practice, which has come out of the lineage of John Young, Tom Brown Jr., grandfather Stalking Wolf, and all the people who've sort of collaborated with them. But there's a wonderful program they developed called the Commander Naturalist Program many years ago, a couple of decades ago. I think they're rewriting it now. But one of the core practices there is this idea of finding a notification from nature, is how I've termed it now, but I think they called it a trigger. But finding a sound or some sort of something that you'll hear at least a dozen times during a day, And when you hear that, it's an invitation to pause, stop, to pause, notice, and reflect or question. And so I use a particular bird species here, the Hadida, and anyone who's been to Southern Africa would know it well. Very loud, you cannot miss hearing it. And that for me is always an invitation to stop. And then I breathe, and then I do anything with it for what I've decided will be the flavor of those days. It might be which direction the wind's coming from, what's the last sound I heard prior to that, which other bird species can I hear in that moment? What's the quietest sound? What's the that I can hear right there and then? Which direction am I facing in that moment? You can go on and on. I also get more philosophical, check in with myself. What's my body feeling? How am I breathing? If I was to be an animal right now, you just have fun with it, and you just give yourself permission to have fun with it. And it's lovely if you're going for a walk down a walk in the woods, but if it happens to you in the middle of a meeting, that's also beautiful, And this is an invitation which can happen where it doesn't matter where you are, whether you're in London or out in the Scottish Highlands. This practice can happen anywhere, because it's also an invitation to look for nature, and even, nature is everywhere. And when this happens, the invitation is also to look for life. And that's a beautiful practice for me when I am in the city, I'm in a room, and I might use a different trigger or notification there. It may not be the Hadida. I might use a friend's cell phone or a taxi horn or something. It doesn't have to be from nature. But that's an invitation to look for nature. And I think the more and more we can use this moment-to-moment awareness and realize that nature connection isn't just something that happens on the weekend when we get out, that it has to happen in the everyday. That's the way our consciousness will start to shift. That's the way we deepen relationality and we start to change the awareness. And it's not an either or, it's a both and more. We still need make time for those moments to get away, but it has to start in the everyday noticing, which can happen anywhere.
Yeah, I love that. One of those ways is also not only sound, but just simply feeling sun touch your skin. And a lot of the teachings around nature connection or Buddhism is honoring the ephemerality of life. But something I've been finding deep, deep solace in the past few months is feeling the sun, especially as it's been winter in this hemisphere, feeling the sun and actually connecting to the permanence of life, and the perseverance, and the same sun at the center of our solar system that our ancestors gazed at, and that the many, many generations ahead will know this sensation of the sun touching our skin. For some reason, that has brought me out of that self-centered worrying about the micro concerns of the day into this greater sense of existence, and there's so many opportunities like that. But when you said about the birds, my brain immediately went to, oh, but double glazing. Which I did an episode with Sam Lee, which will come out soon, and we went into that in more depth. But he's written this amazing book called The Nightingale, Notes on a Songbird, and really looks at how our relationships have changed with the birds and their songs and the seasons through the comfort of our double glazed, well insulated homes.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the work of Vaughan Wilkins, who speaks about enculturated captivity, and he had worked in it was based on his work in the zoos, but he's an ecopsychologist, and he's now related that to our human realm, and this idea that many of the activities that we do, even from an ecopsychology perspective, are forms of enrichment. Just like you would throw a toy in or create a complex enclosure for an animal, we are sort of doing that in ourselves as these creatures of captivity. And the more and more we spend indoors in these sedentary lifestyles and shutting ourselves off from the sounds, from the sensations, the more and more that that distancing is perpetuated. But I love this idea of the sun, because that's just a beautifully connecting all of us. The same sun that you're feeling right now It's the same sun that I've got here, and it's I mean so simple, but it does light up and illuminate, if you excuse the pun. That's that's this idea that we can be all place-based, but but much but connected at any point of time just through that. And there is a permanency to that, obviously changing, and it also has a certain ephemerality about it, but on a much bigger scale. And that's also, I think for us just to understand our place in the cosmos and our place in scales of time. And this is just a very small epoch of geological time that we find ourselves in. And, how do we also relate to that?
Yeah. I'm hearing how important narrative is. That's really coming through in what you're saying. And it comes right back to those mytho-poetic filled mountains in Australia. Were they mountains or rocks? I can't remember now.
Mountains.
Yeah.
Sort of monolithic mountains.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's how important it is to hold enchanted narrative about place and about our belonging within it. That really ties the thread into our sense of stewardship and our sense of place and really our well-being, our meaning making.
Meaning making is huge. Yeah, exactly.
I feel like, I mean, we definitely have capacity to talk for 4 hours. There's two things I'd like to weave in now towards our closing. One is, what is your relationship with indigeneity? Because you've traversed through many lands, and I think there was a moment in ceremony that really was a highlight for me from that last psilocybin retreat, where one of the guests had, it wasn't a didgeridoo. I can never remember the name it actually was. Can you?
Well, to most people it's a didgeridoo, but for the people of Northeast Ireland, it's called the yidaki.
Yidaki. Yes. Okay. I need to really remember that. Yidaki. And then I start hearing this percussive sound on the other side of me, and I turn around, and you just so candidly had brought out, what was that called again?
Yeah, in English you call it the clapsticks, but the language name where I was, it's called Bilma.
Yeah, and it was so beautiful to feel this indigeneity in the music, and also the synchronicity with what you both had actually brought, and to bring that gift into the ceremonial space for people to really receive it was so magical. And so I'd be curious just to hear what your relationship is with sense of indigeneity, and obviously we're all indigenous to this earth, and then there's a whole spectrum of how we relate to the earth, and what that actually means in different contexts that are very important to define. But what is your relationship with that?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's been complex and problematic. I long for indigeneity. I've felt very, and I say that as a contradiction, but I long for the sense of being able to be indigenous to place, and feelings of belonging have been difficult to come by. I never entirely felt I belonged where I grew up in Australia. And then that was just sort of a feeling. But when I did spend time in Aboriginal Australia, then I really was like, oh my gosh, like I just felt so, just so not a part of the fabric of that landscape, given how I was seeing their relationality to that landscape. And then, being in Europe and the Netherlands, it's where my father is from. That was a bit better in some senses, but still I was sort of the Australian, learning Dutch, and so you didn't sort of feel belonging. And then my mother's from New Zealand, and again there, there's the Maori peoples have obviously much longer history, and now in South Africa again, as a white person here, you still feel like one of the newcomers. So it's been challenging, and one longs for that. And a big part of my reconciliation with that is just realizing again the map making of, we're all drawing these lines on a map. It's a human model. The lines that just the names and the lines that become Australia and South Africa and the Netherlands. What's that? Earth knows no difference. And so there's been I've just got the dragonfly visiting there to my left. The same one this morning, yeah. So the sense then is I can be Indigenous to Earth and without sounding hippie, and that's okay. And the indigeneity then, to give that context and to give that meaning, is to really develop a deep relation with a particular place, and yet still be sensitive to all the footsteps that were there before me and all the cultures, and realizing all the claims and stories in place that they have to that land, but feeling that's but the best I can do is to, I guess, perpetuate a kind of reverence for the landscape and relationality with the landscape that had come before me. Yeah, that was a very special moment for me in ceremony. Also, it didn't. Even as a participant in it, it all came together quite sort of quickly, unexpectedly as well, and it was lovely to participate in that. And I certainly know when I was playing that instrument, those particular slapsticks, those bilma, have been hugely important for me, not only for the nature practices that I facilitate. I use them in my facilitation, but also when I've engaged in ceremony after the death of some years ago, my brother's best friend passed away, and in my own little ritual around his death, they seem to have an incredible, powerful effect in communing with the elements and what came up after that. So I embrace it with a awkwardness, in the sense that I'm not Aboriginal, and I'm no longer in Australia. But I also embrace it in the sense that in some deeper part of me, I've always felt Indigenous. And I actually feel, in a way that I can't entirely explain, that I may have lived a previous life on the African continent. And so as a fair-skinned, freckly white guy, trying to somehow reclaim indigeneity, it's a tricky one, and it probably would be easier in Ireland. But I do the best I can where I feel I belong. And at this point in time, I really feel I belong here on the Southern Cape of Africa.
Thank you for speaking to that. And you have your little one, Kai, isn't it? Kai.
That's correct, yeah.
And I can only imagine that when you bring forth new life into the world and into place, the kind of intimacy that unfolds there, because you then start also experiencing through younger eyes again, which really is where I think the groundwork for our belonging just candidly happens, that deep intimacy with everything that's around us. And I love being around children to teach me and remind me that how distracted they can get by everything. And distract is not the right word. Just think of my niece trying to get her to school and how absorbed she can get into whatever is here without any kind of sense of good or bad. It's just interesting to her. And so I'd love to close with anything that feels alive around your vision and hope for the next generation, and what is it that your son is teaching you, or anything along those lines.
My sense of hope these days is, I think, really informed by the idea that hope is not necessarily a belief or optimism in a particular kind of outcome, but it's a sense that it's worth doing because it has to be done, because it's meaningful. And it's kind of like, as we talked about Indigenous cultures doing ceremony, you do them because that in itself is beautiful and work that needs to be done for our own growth, our collective growth. For my son, I really hope and am delighted to be walking with him on that journey of inculcating his sense of place and attention to to what's around him. And it's been delightful now that, that as he recognizes the sounds of birds and starts to imitate them, and he takes an interest in scat and spore, without me trying to put too much pressure on that. That is beautiful. And then noticing a whole lot of things that I failed to notice. There's a part of having kids where you feel it kind of can decimate your nature connection practice in terms of less time you have for yourself to wander or sit or whatever it is. But there's a whole lot else that it brings, and that is helping me to notice what I was missing. The delight in any kind of insect that's stuck in the house, the attention to detail of that, the sense of seeing through new eyes of the butterfly that I see every other day and no longer look at properly, to be with him as he, examines it. That, to be able to live with that kind of awareness and to keep that alive and awake into his future and to help him do that is something that I really hope for. And I hope that for many more children, not just my own, because if it is just him, it's going to get, it's not going to go very far. Nature connection needs a cultural container. It can't happen without that. The two are inseparable. It's lovely to be a sociopathic naturalist and go into the wilds by yourself, but it's not sustainable. Nature connection needs to be held back in a vibrant community where those stories, where those observations are seen, they're mirrored back, they're celebrated, they're sung, they're danced. And I hope that's what I really hope for him, that he can find his community where his sense of relationship with place and connection with nature can be seen, can be celebrated, can be grown. Yeah. And it's not going to be easy. But we have to try. We have to do it. We have to hold up the law of the land.
That's really where I do feel a lot of hope, finding ways to help young people, especially because, for me, I didn't get a smartphone until I was 20, which is quite late for my specific peer group.
Mm-hmm.
But when I think now of how early, my niece is 7 and has already had years with an iPad and access to YouTube. And I think it's so important that, we all put an effort in to create that culture that you just so beautifully spoke of, that holding culture for nature connection and for sense of place.
It's lovely to see you doing that, with your colleagues, because that's where it's at. And that's a really hopeful thing. There are these little communities that you won't see on mainstream, but there are these little communities coalescing. Just my hope is, and maybe a fear is, that they can remember, because there is this tendency, like you say, to these skills are being lost. The language, also the role of language, and all the languages that are being lost to describe this, and it's another huge issue. But we can come together in the best interest of nature connection, but if nature's still this textured wallpaper that's just the setting for our otherwise anthropocentric activities, then I still have a concern as to what sense is that really, how much impact is that happening. But I do believe there are these communities that, they get together and they do the foraging, and they do the basket weaving, and they come and sing. That is really important. Yeah. And it might start with a potluck outside, and that's where it has to start, and that's fine. But I think it takes courage for people in those communities to say, let's try and stretch that now. Let's go a little bit deeper. Next time, let's see if we can build a shelter and stay out overnight, and let's see if we can follow our tracks back to where we came from, or something like that. Yeah, because in that so much else can be cultivated. And I just wish parents knew the decimating effect of smart technology on a kid's cognitive and creative development. And this is, there's some pretty robust neuroscience and psychology, showing that this is not just I do have an inherent bias towards some of tech, without a doubt, and I'm happy to name that. But there's good evidence to support that as well. And it's a real concern. And I just, our son has had very little contact with screens so far, and just what we really value in seeing in him now is the capacity to create a story and play out of nothing. He's, and I have a sense that is a big part of the fact that he hasn't had that done for him. Big time, just with next to nothing of animals coming through, or dinosaurs eating this and that, and that is really rewarding to see, and that gives me hope.
Es mi abuelo que canta, es mi abuelo que canta, es mi abuelo que canta, desde lejos solico, un canta la mola una pacalo. Desde lejos solico, pacala la mola, pacalo.
Thank you for being here with the Rooted Healing community. We offer nature-led ceremonial gatherings, legal and safe psychedelic-assisted psilocybin retreats, embodied deep ecology courses, and a growing collection of nourishing resources. Visit rootedhealing.org to learn more. You can also find us on social media, and all the links are in the show notes. There are some wonderful acts of reciprocity and cross-pollination that you can do if you are enjoying this podcast, which will help others heal and connect, inner and outer landscapes. You can subscribe, rate the show 5 stars, leave a review, and when we get to 50 reviews, we're doing a juicy giveaway. You can share episodes with your community. Sometimes those podcast recommendations from others have been the most potent medicine I've received in the moment. And you can join our Patreon community, where you can actively place value in this resource and receive bonus material, book and gift giveaways, meditations, workshops, episode transcripts, community discussion, and discounts to our events. Your monthly contribution helps us cover the costs of running the show, and our hope is to gather enough abundant gifters to really go the extra mile with this podcast. These acts of connection support this work. Thank you. The music in this episode was gifted by Bonnie Medicine from her latest album, Wide Open. If you'd like to gift your music to the Rooted Healing podcast, please reach out via the link in the show notes. I'm your host, Veronica Stanwell. Thanks for listening.